Hello, everybody. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully you can see me. Sing out in the chat line if you can't. I've got a new camera set up this year, so I have to admit the screen is somewhat detached. So if I'm slow on the chat, my apologies. It's a matter of jumping back and forth between some new monitors and some new cameras, etc. So just trying a new setup, mainly because I'm just trying to reclaim some space back on my office. Too many monitors, too many cameras, too much stuff going on. So I hope you've had a lovely break. If you had a break, hope you've had a good festive season. And yeah, let's get stuck into it. Let me share my screen and we'll get going. Let's see now. As I always say, getting in touch. I love talking tech. Rather than plunder you with a million different ways of getting in touch, just go to linktree/Connor. And yeah, you can get in touch with me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., etc. Anyone new to this office hours? If you're new here for 2021, hopefully you've been at least to some of my office hours in the past. But if not, we're getting up to number 500. We're not far off 500 office hours across the whole program, which is pretty impressive. As I say, do not adjust your set. I put the content down at the bottom left such that when we turn this into videos later, we have a nice display of who's doing the talking, who's doing the typing, and the actual content itself. So that's why it's tucked away down at the left. There's nothing wrong with your screen. As always, I like to do some bits and pieces. Normally it's about all the events coming up, but the reality is if you go to one of my favorite sites for events coming up, clockwise.org, you'll see it's fairly quiet on the agenda at the moment for obvious reasons. We've got RMUG coming up. Audit is still scheduled for later in the year. I think Apex Connect, but yeah, the normal plethora of conferences is fairly low. But it is 2021. Yeah, it's good to be in a new year, and things are looking up. You know, we have vaccines coming out, and yeah, today in particular has been a pretty good day. So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff, and hopefully 2021 is going to be able to kick the dirt of 2020 off the bottom of our shoe and us move on. I had a nice break, although I have to admit, my 2021 started off with this. I'm not sure if you can see this. These are pieces of wood that came from my dog's stomach after it ate a chicken skewer off my plate, which it wasn't meant to do. So that was $1,000 in vet fees down the drain. But I took consolation in the fact that someone sent me this. Basically, it's a Rubik's Cube, which is very easy to solve because it's all one color. But 2021, quick revisit. Since we last spoke, I went to Sangam. That was a great event. And I put these couple of slides up here because in terms of 2021, I think we can fairly say we'll probably be on Zoom and virtual meetings continuously again. And so I challenge anyone running events or even being involved in events, try to think of ways to grab the audience and keep ourselves engaged, keep ourselves interested. At Sangam, we did these things called rapid fire sessions where multiple speakers shared a session, not speaking at the same time. They would actually migrate from one topic to another and have a bit of a handover. So that was pretty cool. UK OEG mixed things up a bit by having a single Zoom session effectively for all speakers, and effectively you sort of came in and came out of rooms in the same way that you would in a physical conference. I thought that worked really well because, once again, it sort of gave a bit more of the closest you can get, I suppose, to a physical feel. Just bring my window over here so I can see it. And given that we are on an office hours session, I just wanted to stress one of the things that I've yet to have a lot of people take up on outside of Perth, which is interesting, is we actually will run these sessions if you want for you. You don't have to join these monthly sessions on any topic. If you want a special topic or a special office hours session just for where you work, whether it's your IT department, whether it's your business IT users and want to learn something about Apex or machine learning, any of the office hours topics, one of the things that we generally do is we'll happily offer what we call, we have cloud at customer, let's call it office hours at customer. So if you want an office hours session for your own company, please reach out to us, get in touch, and we should be able to get something arranged. Speaking of new things for 2021, one thing I'm trialing is I thought we have so many virtual events going on. There's a lot of video content out there. There's a lot of blog content out there. And because it's a great thing, there's so much out there. I'm really thrilled that the world has moved to this place where people want to share their content, which is fantastic. But it also means that for most of us, doing things like reading a blog post or watching a YouTube video means stopping what you're doing and dedicating your time to that topic. And some of us, with the plethora of content out there, we don't have time for all of it. So I thought I'd try something. I thought I'd try a podcast, which is hopefully something you can do without having to worry about stopping what you're doing. You can, do it when you're on your commute to work or doing a gym workout or making dinner or whatever. What have I got something here in the chat? There's a debate. Okay, from Satendra. Okay, we'll get to that. So I've done a few trial episodes. I'm not promising that this is going to go anywhere, but I thought I'd give it a go. And so I've done a few trial episodes. You can get Connor McDonald at podbean.com. If you like them, please drop me a message on Twitter or some other channel, or if you want, just throw comments on the podcast channel. I'm starting with sort of a back to basics kind of flow. But yeah, if you're interested in podcasts and you think that's a good media channel that you can pick up tech content on, obviously we don't have the luxury of then doing demos and the like, but yeah, so give it a go. And if you like it, let me know, and we'll see if it's got some legs. And if you don't like it, let me know as well. And the 3 episodes that are up there will be the last 3 we do. So it's over to you. Please see what you think about the podcast and let me know. Okay, and obviously the big bits and pieces that came out just shortly ago was the fact that 21C is now available, both in paid and free editions on our cloud. Lots of goodies in there. The reason I put a 21 slide in here up there is so I could say, you probably shouldn't be moving to it. I've dwelled on this many times in the past, so I'll just redirect you to this slide. Be aware that for learning new features, picking up new techniques, new tools, seeing what's coming, 21C is definitely a go-to release for you to have a look. But for production systems, big, serious corporate production systems, you probably want to still be on 19C. If you're not on 19C, that's where you want to be jumping to, because you have those huge support windows. We offer 2 things. We have releases where you can take technical advantage. You have a certain competitive edge of getting brand new features, such as the things you'll see in 21C. But if you're one of those places, like most people are, that you upgrade rarely, because we know it costs money to upgrade, it costs testing and regressing, etc. Keep saying 19C is where you want to be. 21C is just that glimpse of the future, and we'll be going 19, and the next big long-term support release would be 23, I think. As I've said for the last 12 months, and we'll probably continue to say for the next 12 months, obviously COVID is still out there. There's hope on the horizon with vaccines and numbers dropping in various countries. But as I said, we'd love to all be together one day again physically, so we can genuinely network, genuinely talk, share a beer, share a beverage, and just chat tech, because we love it. So please stay safe, follow your local bylaws and guidelines, because we want to meet again soon in person. A lot to cover in this session. I'm pontificating and ranting and going on too long. I'll cover a little bit of 21C PLSQL stuff. It's a little bit of stuff I had on a blog post that got a lot of interest on Twitter and other social media channels. So I thought I'd show you the demos for real, but it'll be quick because, as I said, I don't really want to dwell a lot on 21C, because the carrot of a new release is not really what we're focusing on when it comes to systems that will be running production. But we've got some issues when you come to moving to cloud from on-premise, some issues in terms of unified audit trail and how to control the volume of it. Someone had a question about views and the impact of indexes on views. Some free space requirements. If you want to reorg a table, how much free space will you need? An interesting one where an index wasn't used where people think it should have been. Finding out DML error logging tables, we'll talk about that. And if we get time, we'll have a little chat about the any value aggregate function. Simply, I threw that on literally this afternoon because there was a bit of activity on Twitter about it. So a lot to get through. Hopefully most of these are fairly quick. We'll do our best to get through them all. So let's get the 21C PLSQL stuff out of the way first. Really just a repeat of some stuff I put on a blog post showing you some of the cool stuff that's coming in 21C, in particular around the concept of loops and collections and the like. So let me just flick to a chat window. That's that. To a SQL Plus window. That's the right one. What did I call the demo? Hopefully you can see that. So just to fly through some of the things we currently do and some of the luxuries that we will inherit when we move to 21C. If you want to jump to various different levels of iteration, like from 1 to 10, 100 to 110, 200 to 210, 19C, you write 3 loops, and it runs and spits out the numbers you wanted. In 21C, you can now put them all on the single loop line. I want to go from 1 to 10, then from 100 to 110, then to 200 and 210, ad infinitum. It just goes in one loop and it just works in the same way. So a lot of these things are what I call syntactical convenience. They're not, brand new features in terms of changing the way loops fundamentally work. But let's be honest, syntactical convenience means smaller code, tighter code, easier to maintain code. If you wanted to do a step function, which it's funny, like I learned my languages first with BASIC as a child, and even way back then, BASIC had a step function in loops where you could jump by a certain amount. PLSQL, if you wanted to jump by 3, you would loop from 1 to 20 by 1, but then you would do something every time the modulo of 3 equals some value. That's how you had to do it, right? And you get 1, 4, 7, 10, 13, etc. In 21C and beyond, lovely, by 3. By anything you want. Effectively now you can jump the iterations through what we call, this one here is we call the iterand, the thing that actually gets incremented as we loop. One of the nice cool things is it doesn't have to be an integer anymore. So this one looks like it's broken, but bear with me. I'm saying go from 1 to 10, but by increments of 0.5. Now it looks like it's broken. Looks like it did the old style thing of just going up by 1. Let's not forget, what's the default data type for an iterand? It's an integer. So we started at 0.5, which rounds to 1. Then we went to 1.5, which rounds to 2, and so forth. So it looks like this. But in 21C and beyond, you can do this. Let me scroll up a bit. I can say for I, and then declare the kind of numeric data type it is. So I'm saying I is actually a number 3 with a 1 decimal place. I'd like that to go up by 0.5. Because it can now hold a decimal place, it can. So we can bounce by decimal places now as well. In 21C, the iterand still has to be numeric as of this release. But I've heard on the grapevine there is talk of being able to things like iterate through dates and even iterate through strings. For example, searching for patterns in strings in a potential future release, safe harbor, etc. But at the moment, still, you have this now extra control over the numeric part of the iterand. In 19C and before, if you wanted to effectively instantiate a collection, you either loop through the elements you wanted, or we invented this one in 19C, which is you nominate the index and the value. So that's a nice shorthand of of what this used to be, but it's still a fairly verbose syntax. In 21C, you can simply say, here's the values, and by default, they'll just go index 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice that this is not instantiating a nested table, which you can do like that. This is actually a associative array. So all those nice little instantiation facilities you could do with nested tables, you now just get straight out of the box with 21C. The days of copying elements from one to another. For example, here I've instantiated an array in 19C for elements 1 to 10. If I just want all the even elements, I would have to do something like this. Once again, the modulo, looking for every second index, and this in the end is then just looping through them to actually print them out. So you can see 1 didn't get instantiated, 2 does exist, 3 didn't, and so forth. So that's how you sparsely populate an array in 19C. In 21C, the for loop can go inside the assignment. How nice is that? So I want S2 to be for I in 2 to 10, stepping by 2, taking the elements from S1. And the rest is just the facility just to print it out as before. So yeah, same result, nice tight syntax. In 19C and before, if I've got something which is a sparse array and I want to loop through it, I sort of would jump to the first index and then sort of do this thing of, if the index is not null, then yes, it exists. So I'd simply loop through and then do a next. Not anymore. And that's the result. In 21C, I can say for IDX in indices of. That used to be available for sparse arrays which were indexed by varchar 2. Now it's just across the board for indices, and I get them. I don't have to just use the indices. I can now say also for the values. So rather than printing out the indices, I can actually print out the values inside those indices. Or I can do both. I can have for X and Y, I nominate 2 iterands for the pairs. So index 2 contained value 20, index 4 contained value 40, etc. Very, very cool. Just really nice, convenient stuff. If you wanted to do things where the iterand changed in 19C, you couldn't. So if I wanted to go from I from 0 to 10, but really wanted to use the power of 2 of I couldn't do that. I had to basically pick up with a different number. I had to calculate an expression. I'm interested in the powers of 2, the powers of I. Let me try that sentence again. I'm interested in 2 to the power of I, not the value of I itself. And Bailey has come to join us early in office hours. Hello, Bailey. In 22, I can actually do it in the for loop itself. I'm saying take this integer, it starts at 1, I repeat, timesing it by 2 until the power gets below some limit. This is much closer to your standard sort of looping constructs you have in C, Java, etc., where you have, starting value, increment value, and then a terminating condition. Very cool. You can do enormous things. For example, this one, I can go from 1 to 10, increment by 1 while I is less than 5. Then I go from 6 to 15, but by I divided by 4, which will be the last value I had from the previous step, etc. Incredible power. I don't know how you'd do this in 19C. You'd probably have to have some variable and do some very complex stuff, but now you have this total control over what you want the iterand to do and how it increments dynamically throughout the iterations themselves. And finally, just to quickly finish off this one on 21 PLSQL, is ref cursors. Ref cursors are great because for a lot of 3GL kind of languages like C#, Java, etc. The native sort of facility is you open a ref cursor, you give that back to the calling environment, and it handles all the fetching and everything. So ref cursors have always been cool, but when you wanted to use them in PLSQL, it was actually a little bit more complicated. You would sort of have to declare some records, and they could be explicitly declared like this or have %type, %row type, and then you would fetch from the row cursor, and then you would loop through what you fetched to get array processing, etc. And out comes the results querying the empno from the employee table. In 21C, I have an externally open ref cursor. Doesn't matter. I just go for R in values of the ref cursor, as if that ref cursor was an associative array. It handles the bulk fetching, etc. I just did R number because this cursor is only selecting one column, which is a number. If I'm selecting more things, like I'm selecting empno and ename, I simply declare a record type as I normally would, and I simply do for R of that type record in values of. Same thing. It's effectively now doing a vector fetching into a tuple as opposed to a single value. Super easy stuff. It's just all of this stuff is syntactical convenience, but man, it gets me excited about PLSQL in 21C because A, it's nice and tight now, really compact language, less chances of making errors, and also it's that nice proof, that sort of slap in the face that people like going, oh, PLSQL, it's 30 years old, it's a dead language, no one ever does anything to it. You can see we are actively building and improving the PLSQL language here in Oracle 21. Okay, a couple of Q&As. What if the ranges for the loop overlap? With the overlapping indexing process multiple times, are they distincted? I expect the former. I would have to do a test case for that, Eric, but I will get back to you. And does pair work for index by varchar too? I haven't yet tested that, but that's a good question. I will actually do a blog post on that to answer that question. I would expect it would, simply because most of these things, as we've seen, pretty much the part of the beauty of 21C is what we've done is the kind of things that used to work for index by varchar 2 now work everywhere and vice versa. So we're trying to sort of complete the implementation. But I won't mark those questions as answered because I'll answer them with some definite test cases and a blog post. So 21C out of the way. As I said, 19C is probably where you will be spending a good chunk of your time for genuine production systems, unless those 21C features give your business a strong competitive edge and you need to leap to them. The cloud and UTC. You may have heard of this thing called the cloud. There seems to be a lot of vendors pushing you to move your databases to the cloud, Oracle being one of them. And yes, that is true. The cloud seems to be the future. That's where things are going. Here's the question that came in. We're moving our databases to the cloud, but cloud databases are all UTC by default. Now, let me caveat that. I assume this person is moving to a database service, as in the database is being managed for them. Obviously, if you just go get some server hardware off our cloud or anyone else's cloud, then you can do whatever you want in terms of time zones, etc. But if you're moving to a managed service, the most likely thing that's going to be the case is that database is probably running UTC time zone. But they said, this means all of our code references to sysdate are now invalid. Is there anything we can do? So let's do a quick review of why they've got themselves into a bit of difficulty, because I'd be willing to bet this is something that we would all probably encounter, because I know when I'm looking for the current time, I go sysdate, etc. Sysdate is just that thing that rolls off the fingertips whenever you're looking for today. But in reality, we probably should be a bit more precise. Here's why everyone uses sysdate. If I go buy a server, I'll install it and it'll say, where do you live? I'll go Perth, which is GMT plus 8, and the server will be running in GMT plus 8. I put a database on that server and the database goes, the OS is running in Perth, so I'll run in Perth as well. And guess what? Most of my clients will probably be connecting from their machines in Perth. And even if my clients were coming from, say, the other side of Australia, which is GMT plus 11, they're probably going to be using a system where they go, yes, it's a Perth system. A lot of us have systems which are very, what I would call insular to our geography, interdepartmental apps, etc. We have certain apps, obviously, which generally nowadays are growing in their availability. They used to be available on site. Now people can get to them on their phone or Excel software. And of course, as companies become more global, they get accessed from everywhere. Because we're so used to systems all running in the time zone where we're sitting, when someone says, show me the sales for the last hour, I go, well, what's now? Sysdate, lop off 1 divided by 24, that's an hour. There's my query. What could possibly go wrong? Here's the problem. I brought up my phone and took a screenshot of my clock feature. And it shows me that I did this morning. You can see at 11:44 a.m. in Perth time, it was 11:44. I have a couple other zones on there because San Francisco, sometimes I have meetings with people in head office. And so forth. It was 7:44 p.m. the previous day. And London, which is effectively just my way of picking up where GMT is, nice and easy, it was 3:44 a.m. On my database, when I do select sysdate from Joule, it says it's 11:44 because I'm living in Perth, my database is in Perth. But obviously, if I talk to the cloud database I have running on the London region, it says 3:44 a.m. because that's the time in London. Or is it? Because if I log on to my ATP free instance, which actually is housed out of the Sydney cloud region for Oracle, it also says 3:44 a.m. And that's definitely not the time it was in Sydney then. This is because it's not the London time. It just happens that London coincides with UTC at this particular point in time, namely Greenwich Mean Time. So even when I talk to my other cloud database, my ADW warehouse is running in Phoenix cloud region, I also get UTC. All these managed services are generally running UTC. What's the drama? Sysdate is the date and time on the server, and therefore it's not the time that I'm experiencing right now. If you want that, we have a function that's been there for a fair while called current date, and that's the date and time on the client. And so if you actually look, for example, if I connect to my ATP instance, it says the time on the database was 11:19, but the current date, I ran this later on today, is now 19:19. That's 20 past 7, that 80 minutes ago when I put this slide in. That's how tight we run things here. So the question that came is, well, when I pointed this out, the person said, well, that means for a lot of our code, especially the user-facing stuff, we need to go change the source code to references from sysdate to current date. A, we've got to find them all, and B, that's a big job and really high risk. Is there any other way? And so here's the solution we provided for them, and I thought you'd find this interesting. Okay, for a long time, we've had a facility called SQL Translation Profiles. And really, they weren't designed for what you're about to see. They were originally designed, and I'll do a demo to prove this, to actually say, I'm coming in from, say, Postgres, or I'm coming in from, say, SQL Server, but I want to run a query on the Oracle database, or I might be doing a complete migration. from one of those platforms to Oracle, I don't want to have to rewrite my SQL. Can the database layer do it for me? And it's a fairly powerful facility. Let's explore this. I'll create a profile called Silly, and you'll see why it's called Silly in a second. Here is my first translation. Whenever I see select star from scott.emp, I'd like you to rewrite it to scott.department. Now, I'll grant that to Scott. I turn that SQL translation profile on for this session. I run select star from scott.emp and nothing happened. It still ran select star from scott.emp. I was expecting it to automatically rewrite it. This is because this facility was originally designed as being for foreign platforms talking to us. SQL Plus is not a foreign platform. It's sitting there inside the database. And therefore, we actually had to do this. We had to set a particular event 10601, to say, even though I'm coming with a database connection, I'm coming from SQL Plus, just assume that I'm actually a foreigner. I'm coming from some strange platform. When I do that, we actually see the SQL translation profile in action. It says, I do a select star from emp, and we actually get the results from select star from dep. Now, obviously, that's a nonsensical demo. And anyone who's rubbing their hands with glee thinking SQL injection, here we come. Yeah, that's true. Obviously, you use this with some due care. But let's get rid of that SQL profile and do something a little bit more intelligent. So I'll drop this the Silly profile. I'm going to create, the first thing I'm going to show here is the fact that we realize that this is actually a fairly powerful facility. So rather than only being limited now to things that come in foreignly, from a foreign source, we've actually adjusted this now. I think this change came in 18C. I'm creating a profile called demo profile, but now inside the API itself, I can say it's not just to be applied when foreign SQL syntax comes in. So I'm saying if it's foreign, let me start again. This attribute is saying, do I only apply the profile if the SQL is a foreign syntax? And I'm saying, no, it's false. So this will be applied for Oracle syntax as well. And then I've done the same thing. I've registered, once again, a bit of nonsense, change scott.emp to scott.dep. The advantage of that is once I've granted the SQL translation profile and turned it on for my session, no more event 1000601. It just happens straight out of the box. So I think it was 18, we changed this such that now it doesn't have to be just foreign SQL syntax coming in. You can nominate using attributes whether you want it to apply for all SQL syntax. So let's have a look at how we can now tackle the problem at hand. I'll drop that profile. Now I'm going to create a package. And this package is called a date translator. And these APIs have to be effectively, they're hard-coded. Effectively, it must be one called translate SQL, must be one called translate error, and it must take these particular parameters, because you'll see where this is going to be used shortly. And here's my package body. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my incoming SQL text, translate any occurrences from sysdate to current date minus 50 by 365. Now, the reason I'm changing it to something which is 50 years ago is such that we get a difference in output even though I'm running on my local database. I'm not going to run this on a cloud database. So I wanted to dynamically change the SQL such that the results I see with one query will disappear when it comes to a next query. And similarly, I'm going to change all occurrences of sys timestamp with current timestamp. So if I was doing this for the original person's question, it would be sysdate gets changed to current date. And I'm not doing anything with translating errors, because you can even translate error codes and error messages with this translation profiles. Let's now create a profile, and here's where that package can be used. I create a brand new profile. As before, I said it's not just for foreign SQL, it's for all SQL. But I have this new thing. I have an attribute called what translator do I want to use? And it's the name of my package. So now as SQL comes in, it will call this package to do the translation because we've set this attribute for this particular SQL profile. I grant the SQL profile, and let's see this in action. I haven't enabled it yet for this session. So I run select star from scott.emp, it just runs fine. When I do select star from scott.emp where high date less than sysdate, I get all the rows because all the high dates are valid because I haven't turned the profile on yet. This proves that this query hasn't been translated because I still got all the rows. I alter my session to enable this profile. I run select star from scott.emp. there's no reference to sysdate in there, so it runs unaltered. I run select star from scott.dep where hire date less than sysdate, which originally brought back all the rows. I now get none because this query has been dynamically changed from sysdate to current date minus 50 years. So we actually excluded all the rows just to prove that the SQL profile was actually working. It's done even before parse time. So if we actually go look at VSQL, we can see here's the one that came in before we applied the profile, and here's the one that came in after we applied the profile and we dynamically changed it. So you can see that this query got converted to this query using the SQL translation profile. Pretty cool. Let's drop that profile off just to clean up for the rest of the session, but hopefully that shows you, let me go back to slideshow. Anything else in there? No. So hopefully that shows you one of the cool things with SQL translation profiles. It used to be grab an entire SQL, replace it with this SQL. Now we don't have to be just foreign SQL syntax, so we can now do it on our own systems. But also we have these attributes like translation packages, which lets us now pick and choose elements of an incoming SQL and dynamically replace them with whatever we like. In this case, we can change sysdate to current date and systimestamp to current timestamp to solve hopefully the vast majority of the UTC systems for this person who's using a managed database service on the cloud. So hopefully that all makes sense. Unified auditing volume. How are we going for time? We're always going badly on time, aren't we? Not to worry. So unified auditing, for those that haven't seen it before, is for a long time we've had one audit facility. You could audit to the operating system or audit to the database. But then as time goes on, as requirements change, we introduce things like fine-grained auditing and other elements which were sort of bolt-ons to existing audit infrastructure. And as a result, DBAs were getting frustrated because you would look here for certain audit, you would look here for certain audit, look here for certain audit, etc. So unified auditing, as the name suggests, is to bring all that together under one umbrella. And that's pretty cool. There's a lot more power in the commands you have, and we'll see a demo of that shortly. Here's the question that came in, though, with regard to unified auditing. We need to audit when a table is accessed, but since in some parts of our application database, it's accessed extremely heavily, is it possible to audit the occurrence of just the first time in a session? Long story short, no, you can't do it declaratively. Now, when this first question came in, I thought, this will be easy, because if you've ever created an audit policy, one of the things you have there is you say create audit policy. For example, I'm going to call it grab Scott employee for any select on the Scott.employee table, and I can say evaluate it just per session, rather than and the other option of per statement, etc. So it's just per session. Might be able to hear police cars. There's police sirens outside my house. Hopefully I've done nothing wrong. And I thought this evaluate per session, I thought would do it just once per session. I was mistaken. Evaluate per session only makes sense in pairing with another clause that comes in with unified auditing when you're defining a policy, which is the when clause. And so these two things actually are bound together, which is if I have a when clause, i.e. I only want to audit a select on Scott.emp when the user is, say, ask Tom, it's when do I evaluate that expression? Do I evaluate it just once per session? Do I evaluate it every time the statement is run? Because obviously the user doesn't change, but other things may change in this expression that might change during the lifetime of the session. So evaluate per session only exists under the wrapper or the boundary of evaluating this when clause. It's not how often we actually choose to grab the audit information. So I tried to come up with a workaround for this particular customer, and I thought I'd show it to you just in case you want to pursue something similar. And also it's a useful way of seeing unified auditing if you haven't moved to it yet in your databases. So I'm going to create a table called customer transactions. It's just a copy of Scott.emp, it's a brand new table so we can see our audit information nice and clearly. I'm going to create an audit policy called capture customer trans whenever someone does a select on the customer trans table. I turn that policy on by audit policy. Now that policy is now active. This just shows how you find out where policies exist. It's in the Audit Unified Policies table with a policy name that says, yes, I'm doing a select. There's no when clause. I'm on the customer trans table. That's what disappeared a second ago. But there's our audit policy. I jump on and I start running some queries. So I select from customer trans, I do a count star from customer trans, I do a max employee number from customer trans, just a few queries. I reconnect as sysdba, and normally I wouldn't have to run this. I only do this because the unified audit trail is kept in memory for performance reasons and flushed at regular intervals. So in order to make sure that I've flushed it out before I run a query, I've actually manually come along and said, look, just flush it out to make sure it's there. But normally this would happen automatically at regular intervals as memory gets under pressure. So that's one of the performance benefits of unified audit trail. But I've flushed it out. Drag the screen down a bit. I flushed it out, and you can see I did 3 queries, and they were all captured. 9:35, 9:36, 9:36:02 p.m., all on customer trans. So we can see that every time I access it, it's being dumped into the audit trail, and this is what someone's trying to avoid. So I'll turn off the audit policy, and I'll try to come up with a better option. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a context variable, which is defined as global, which means all sessions can see the same values, to see if I can manipulate the way my auditing is working. So I'll create a context called audctx, and it's accessed globally. All sessions can share it. I'm going to create a very simple package to actually control the values inside that context. So turn a table on, turn a table off, and we'll see how that is used shortly. So table on is pretty simple. I simply set a context variable inside my context with the upper of the table name, and I set the value to 1. Really, it's just the existence of a context entry with the table name inside that context audctx that I'm interested in. And I've got one table off as well, which simply sets it back to null. Now I'm going to recreate my audit policy to look inside that context every time I run a statement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look inside syscontext audctx for the customer trans table, because this is a policy on the customer trans table. I could have multiple policies on different tables, each one looking for a different context key, and I'll see if it's null. So if it's null, I'm going to actually go and audit that information. I'll evaluate it every time someone runs it. My policy is created. Let's turn that policy on. Once again, we can prove that the thing is there, and now we actually have a statement level evaluation on there as well. I connect to Scott and I run select star from customer trans. Now, I've done nothing with that context so far, and therefore that should be captured. But this is what I would do. In the background, probably as a scheduler job, I would have something along these lines. I'm going to simply go look through the unified audit trail, the thing that captures where all the audit records are, see if any for the username of Scott and the object name is not null. I could obviously firm up this criteria if I wanted to, but I'm assuming that any object in here is going to be a table. I'm going to set the context variable for that table to be on. Effectively, I'm going to put a 1 in the context variable customer trans. And therefore it says, I've now saying that customer trans has already been captured in my unified audit trail because it exists in here. And now I'm going to set this context variable. Remember, my audit policy said I only capture it if the context variable is null. So in theory, this context variable now should be set to 1. So if I connect to Scott again and run some more queries, there's a count star from customer trans, there's the max emp node. If I go back to sysdba, flush out my audit trail, what do I get? I have just the 3 rows. Oh, I thought I would have had an extra one, to be honest. Maybe I've set the context too quickly. Oh, bug in the demo. I did actually create a scheduler job to actually to run in the background. So yeah, it's obviously come along too quickly. But hopefully we get the idea. I've not captured all the subsequent queries to customer trans because a context variable has been set globally, and therefore none of the sessions can actually, that when they evaluate the policy, will see that they've already at some stage captured it. It's a way of limiting the volume. I need to turn off that scheduler job. Too much demos going on. Number 3, quick drink of water. Views and indexes. We have a very large PLSQL code base that was mysteriously having issues with large invalidations recompilations. As in, we all know that when you drop a table, anything that's referring to that table, like PLSQL triggers, etc., get invalidated. But they had views. We tracked it down to when we dropped an index. Some views on the table with the dropped index then became marked invalid, and things cascaded from there. Why would dropping an index make a view invalid? And that's a very interesting question. There's actually a friend of mine named Jock who posed this via an email. And funnily enough, it's actually in the documentation. The docs actually say if you drop indexes, then views may become invalid, but doesn't explain why. And so this led to a bit of investigation as to why would dropping an index on a view, by dropping an index on a table, make a view on that table go invalid? Because the view definition hasn't changed. None of the columns have changed. In reality, we only need to do it on certain views, but we generally don't discriminate. And we can explain why with a little demo. So let's do our next demo. View OH, bad typing, OH, view IDX. So I'm going to start very, very simple. We'll go through when it doesn't necessarily have any impact. This is because that's what we would typically expect. I'll create a table called T, a select star from scott.emp. Create an index on the employee number. Let's create a very simple view as select star from t.emp, and we can see that the view is currently valid. Nothing spectacular there. I drop the index on the view, on the table, and guess what? The view is still valid. So obviously not all views get marked invalid. Normally, this very simple view looks just fine. Now I do a unique index on the employee table. Same thing, create my very simple view, just select star from t.emp. The view is valid as we see. I drop that index and the view is now invalid. So there's obviously a difference between an index on a table from which a view sits on top and a unique index on a table where a view sits on top. And it's only in the unique index case that views on those tables get marked invalid. So we can limit our exploration to that. How do we fix an invalid view? It's just like PLSQL. You do alter view vsimple compile, and it becomes valid again. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, if you didn't compile it, the next attempt to access that view would also dynamically recompile it, and then you'd be off and running. But as our original questioner said, they had tens of thousands of objects depending on tens of thousands of views, and therefore the problem went away, but they had this huge invalidation and recompilation impact just because they dropped an index. Let's explain why unique indexes might have an impact on views by upping the game, so to speak, and making our view a bit more complicated. So I'll create a table called tDepartment as a copy of scott.department and put a unique index on that as well. Let's do a very classical kind of join on those two tables, employee being a child of department. So my view called vJoin is all the columns from employee plus the department name. I want to see the department name plus all the employee details as well. The view is valid, that's fine. But here's the key thing. Way back in Oracle 7.3, we introduced the concept of what we call an updatable join view. Views were always updatable if they were just a simple query on a table with no aggregation, etc., just a one-to-one simple query on top of a table. In 7.3, that long ago, we improved that functionality by saying if a view is defined in a certain way, even if it's a join view, you can still update it. And in this case, you can sort of make an assessment that it's fine to update this join view because I'm going from the employee table. So all the rows here come from the employee table. I'm doing a lookup to the department table. There's a unique index on department number, so I know I'm only going to get one row back. This view is what we call key preserved, i.e. for one row in the employee table, there will always be one row in the view. As a result, I'm allowed to insert, update, delete any of the employee columns because there's a one-to-one mapping back to the employee table. I'm not allowed to tinker with the department name because that points off to a different object and is not key preserved because one row in the view does not map to one row in the department table. One row in the department table maps to many rows in the view. To prove that you can do this, I can actually update the vJoin and change the salary column. No problems with that. Let's roll it back. Now I'm going to drop the unique index on the department table. The view has become invalid. Now the reason it's become invalid is because of this. If I go look at user updatable columns, that is unchanged. It still says all these things are updatable. Now, that seems a bit weird because I can no longer have this guarantee that I'm going to have a one-to-one mapping between my view and the employee table. There's no unique index on the department table, so it's quite possible that that join might get back multiple rows for a single employee row. We can't guarantee it anymore. The data as we have will be fine, but we can't guarantee it anymore. The reason the view gets marked invalid is because when we dynamically try to access it again, it has to be recompiled. To recompile it, goes and refreshes all these columns in user updatable columns. We can see if I try to an update, it says you cannot modify a column which maps to a key preserved table. Just looking at the screen as you see there, that looks like a contradiction. It says, yes, I can, but then no, I can't. That's because these attributes were before the view got marked invalid. The compilation phase has updated these facilities, and now that there is no unique index on the department table, none of the columns are now updatable. This is why we have to set a view to be invalid when you drop a unique index on a dependent table. It's our flag to say, when you come back, we're going to have to recompile the view, update all our updatable columns, no pun intended, to make sure they reflect the current state of play and therefore control things like this correctly. And that's why we do it for unique indexes. Just even the attempt of trying to do that update, recompiled the view, it fixed up all these columns, and the view has now become valid. So that's why we do it. When you drop a unique index, it might change the updatableness, so to speak, of a join view. But we don't care. We simply say if it's a view that has a unique index sitting underneath it, it gets marked for recompilation no matter what. And that's why we do it. Key points here. Even though there's now a dependency between that view and that unique index, you won't see it in DBA dependencies. We don't explicitly store a dependency between those two. So be aware of that. If you're going looking for the dependencies between views and unique indexes, it won't be there. The dependency is simply not listed. It's only via the compilation of the view that we pick it up. Even if you set a view to be read-only, it'll still be marked invalid when you drop the unique index. We don't take that next level to say, oh, it's a read-only view, therefore the updatableness is therefore not an issue. And it doesn't matter if the view is an additioning view, etc. Because the index is a base edition object. We only create the index in the base edition. Someone's saying, can you set the view to be non-updatable to prevent it becoming valid? I think I've just answered that, but what do we say? Snap, when we both think about the same thing. Here's a quick related topic in terms of, which also talks about this, it's sort of a subtle variation on the question you've just asked, Rob, in terms of interesting things about views and the things we can do to constrain them. Here's a new table called My Tab. It's just a one column thing. Here's the world's most trivial view sitting on top of it. Create my view called VW. Select star from My Tab where X is greater than 0 with the check option, and I've given that check option a named constraint. So most people will be familiar with this. The check option says when I put a row into this view, the resulting row must be visible in the view. So I can't, for example, put a -1 into this view, even though I could put it into the table. And we can prove that. I just make sure the constraint is there. Add the constraint, yes. So I try insert into the view -1. It says no because the view has a check option, i.e. any insert I do via the view must be visible when I come back via the view. And this is unrelated to compilation. This is simply a proof of concept of how the check option works for views. And we can see it was done with a constraint. Let's now do this though. I want to alter the view and drop that constraint. Quiz time. When I try insert into my view this value of -1, now that I've dropped that constraint, what will happen? Nothing. Interestingly enough, when you actually put a constraint, name constraint along with a check option, it's really effectively for annotative purposes. It's such that as you come along later, you can query the data dictionary and see those views that have the check only option without having to look at the actual view DDL itself, because there's no column in user views that says whether it's got the check option. It's actually just sitting in the DDL. So when you give a named constraint, that creation of a constraint is purely as an annotation, like a dictionary comment saying, yes, you've got a check only option. If you drop the constraint, all you've done is drop the annotation. The with check only or with check option is enforced because it is defined in the view DDL. So I thought I'd throw that in there because it's sort of similar to the concept of read-only views and the impact of unique indexes on it. But just an interesting one there for you that, yeah, don't think about dropping the constraint because it doesn't actually change the check option of the view itself. Quick question, which looks a little bit out, off the topic, but I'm looking for a PLSQL solution to get rid of one FTP tool. Would you recommend some APIs for doing FTP from a database server to another server? Okay, if you search for PLSQL SFTP, a friend of mine named Anton wrote a very sophisticated FTP solution which uses secure sockets, the whole shebang, as a database PLSQL package. So that's one thing you explore. I think Tim Hall has a non-secure FTP package, just uses stock standard UTL, I think TCP, but not through SSL. Most FTP sites don't support that anymore, but if it's all internal, you might be able to get away with that. But search for those two things and yeah, you'll find a PLSQL solution. I'm not entirely convinced that's a great way of doing things, to be honest. That's a fair bit of code. Generally, if I was looking at FTPing, I'd be more inclined maybe to dump, whatever the data is out somewhere and just use either an external program to do it because there's so many APIs out there to do it. But whatever works best for you. But yeah, be aware that there are PLSQL solutions out there. Yeah, search for SFTP Anton, and you'll probably stumble across the solution. Okie dokie. Free space. How are we going for time? Oh, man. Oh, well. There's always next month. I'm looking at reorganizing some tables to fix up some fragmentation. What is a reasonable estimate of how much space I'll need to perform the operation? So there's two things we should talk about here. One is let's talk fragmentation. The first thing is, I've said this in previous office hours things, if you have an object in lots of extents and that's why you're reorganizing it, forget about it. It's not an issue. If you have a lot of empty space in your table, but you're still going to keep adding rows to that table in future, don't worry about it. That's free space we reused, a waste of time reorganizing. If that table has reached some sort of steady state and you want to reclaim some space, or you want to, for example, compress it, or you want to recluster it so the data is differently sorted, then yes, then they are justifiable reasons for reorging tables. But just to re-stress again, the concept of defragmenting a database is not a hard disk drive. So be aware that reorging is something that's generally pretty rare. Having said that, when it comes to how much space you need, the answer is it depends. And this was a discovery I made when I ran out of space recently trying to do a similar operation for a demo. And you'll see some subtle differences now with some of the facilities we have available when it comes to reorg. Let's have a go. A nice easy way of seeing how much space we'll need throughout the entire process of a reorg is I'll create a table space here. It's called demo. It's tiny. It's 10 megabytes. And it's only going to grow by 1 megabyte at a time. I'm going to do all my operations in here because then the high watermark of how big that data file gets shows me how much temporary, let me start again. The high watermark of that table space will show me the temporary high watermark of demand I needed, even though the final result might be smaller. So I'm going to create a table that's 25 copies of DBA objects. So that's, I don't know, a million rows or so. It should be a few hundred megabytes, I think. Yeah, so if I see how big it is, I've done bytes divided by a megabyte. So this table is 336 megabytes, and it's the only thing in that brand new table space. And as you'd expect, the table space has grown to a little bit more than that. The reason it's grown more than just 336 is one of the interesting things is Oracle now has a background process that actually tries to stop you from ever constantly hitting the barrier. It'll take jumps to hopefully avoid you having to delay the auto extend while your operation is running. But you can see it's about the same, about 340 megs the table space has grown to. Now I move that table. Now a move has to take the existing data and rewrite it somewhere else. And it's done. So we can see the table space grew to about double the size. 330 plus 330 gives about 670-ish. So temporarily, we can see we obviously need twice the space because the data is effectively copied to a new location and then the old one is freed up again. So we can see our segment is still 336 megabytes in size. It actually moved from probably the start of the table space to here, and then this space got freed up again for other segments to now use. So a standard move is going to take you double the space. Let's drop the table space, recreate it nice and small. Recreate our same table, same size, about 330 megabytes or so. Chug. It's 336 megabytes. My table space is the same size. This time I'll move it and compress it. So now I'm reading the data, 330 megabytes. The question is, do we copy it all and then compress it? Or do we copy the compressed version? The table space only grew to 455 megabytes, which is promising. If I look at how big the compressed data is, it's 100 meg. So it went from 330 meg, we read it, we compressed it on the fly, resulting in 100 megabyte compressed. Therefore, the temporary high watermark was about 450 megabytes. The original 330 plus the extra 105 to actually store both. But that's cool. It shows that we don't have to write an entire segment again and then compress it. We compress as we're reading, which is pretty cool. Let's drop it again. Once again, 300 megabytes or so, etc. Same size. Now I'm doing one of the cool things in 12.2 and above, the ability to move a table without interruption to service. So I'm moving the table, I'm reorganizing it, but people can still actively access it because I'm doing it online. Here's an important gotcha when you're doing online move. The data file grew to 858 megabytes. My segment is 336. So I went from 350, give or take, to 350, give or take. So at worst 700, yet my table space grew to 858. It was bigger than the sum of the two parts. That's a key thing when it comes to moving online. You actually have an additional space requirement. So what's going on? So we're going to do this again, but now we're going to get a second session ready so we can see what's going on. So what this is doing is just querying the contents of DBA segments for that table space. So we can see there's just the one segment in there at the moment. So we're going to go again, move online, come back, have a look. And we can see there's all these things created in there as the move is going on, and eventually they disappear. Let's stop that. So you can see, whoops, wrong one. You can see the move is completed. When I bring this one back up, while the move was going on, I had my original table. This one here is a temporary segment, which is the table being built, the new version being built. It's the one that's growing. If I scroll back a bit, so it was 285 megabytes, then 350, and then it was done. But these other ones, RM, tab, IoT top, etc., that sit there temporarily during the operation, but disappear once the operation is complete. But you do need to allow space for them. And you can see this particular one, RM tab, grows as well, 55 megabytes, 75 megabytes, etc. And eventually it disappeared. So be aware of that. I can kill this one off now. Let's go back to our slides. Because it's transient, I couldn't do a describe while it was running, but I took a screenshot from another one I did. This RM tab table is effectively being used for making sure we can map between the original rows and the target rows should someone do an operation on them during the online move. Because remember, people can be deleting, inserting, updating, etc. So what we have is we have the source row ID and the target row ID, so we know where the pairs are. So if someone makes a change to the table, we go, yes, okay, that source row ID, that change needs to be reflected in the target row ID. So effectively, this is a copy of all the row IDs for the table. What that means is when it comes to doing a reorg, I'm out of time, or this will be our last topic. The rule of thumb is don't let things run tight. It's just not worth having a reorg fail just because you were thinking, okay, I'll go right to within the nearest 1 megabyte of how much free space I have. Give yourself plenty of free space just in case, especially if you're doing it online, because you're going to need a copy of the original table, the new table, plus 2 row IDs, which is 6 bytes each for every single row. So that could be millions and millions of row IDs that will be consuming as well. This is my adjusted rule of thumb. When I say don't run things tight, if you want a really successful implementation of a database in terms of money, performance, etc., you want your service to run hot. And this is a battle you'll always have with system admins, right? You want your systems to run as close to the wire on CPU as you can, because if your system needs 2 CPUs and you're licensed for 12, you've wasted 10 CPUs worth of license money. That's just throwing money away. You want your service to run hot, but you want your storage to run cold, i.e. lots and lots of free space. In these days nowadays of flash and solid state devices, they run best the more empty they are. So what you want to be doing is, for a really successful Oracle database, is you skimp on CPU, and that money you save by running them close to the wire on CPU, you spend on bucket loads of excess storage, and then things will run sweet. There's Connor's little tip for running a successful cloud database or an on-premise database. Once again, thank you very much everyone for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to all, but we will get to them obviously next month, as we always do. The questions up there, I've got to take a copy of them before I end the Zoom meeting, otherwise they'll disappear. But yes, so I'll cover those up, Eric and Niels, and these PLSQL ones. I knew you'd be interested in the 21C stuff, even though I told you that 19C was where it's at. But as always, thank you very much for your time, everyone. I'll make this available via recording as well. And we'll see you next month for another office hours. Bye for now, everyone.